When Rebecca Thornfield handed over a quarter at a roadside livestock auction in the remote mountains of West Virginia, purchasing what appeared to be an undernourished miniature donkey out of pure compassion, she had no idea she was acquiring the key to a century-old mining fortune that would expose one of the region's wealthiest families and restore justice to an entire mountain community. For within the peculiar markings on that small creature's hide lay coordinates to a mystery that powerful interests had worked for generations to keep buried deep in the Allegheny ridges. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if stories like this touch your heart, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I've got something even more extraordinary waiting for you. The crisp October morning air carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves as Rebecca Thornfield stood on the sagging front porch of her family's homestead, surveying the 40 acres of exhausted land that stretched up the mountainside. At 31 years old, she felt decades older, worn down by the relentless struggle to maintain what 4 generations of Thornfields had built in these unforgiving West Virginia mountains. The homestead sat high in Mercer County, tucked into a hollow where Blackberry Creek cut through the rocky terrain before joining the larger Bluestone River miles below. It was beautiful in a harsh, austere way, the kind of beauty that demanded respect and offered no comfort to those who couldn't meet its challenges. Rebecca's great-great-grandfather, Josiah Thornfield, had claimed this land in 1897, back when the mountains were still relatively untouched and a man with determination could carve out a life from the wilderness. He'd built the original cabin with his own hands, raised 7 children, and died at 93, never having traveled more than 50 miles from where he was born. Each generation had added something to the property. Her great-grandfather expanded the cabin into a proper house. Her grandfather built the barn that still stood, though now its roof sagged dangerously in the middle. Her father had installed the deep well that provided the sweetest water Rebecca had ever tasted, even if the pump needed replacing every few years. But each generation had also taken something. The soil that once produced abundant harvests of corn, beans, and squash now yielded maybe a third of what it used to. The forest that had provided timber, game, and medicinal plants had been logged over by her grandfather during hard times in the 1960s and never fully recovered. The small coal seam that ran beneath the eastern portion of the property had been exhausted by her father's generation, leaving behind a honeycomb of unstable tunnels that made that section of land unusable. Rebecca had inherited all of it 6 months ago when her father, Douglas Thornfield, finally succumbed to the black lung disease that had been slowly suffocating him for 15 years. He'd worked in the Blackwood family's deep mines from age 18 to 47, breathing in coal dust every day, until his lungs could no longer handle it. The company had fought his disability claim for 3 years, forcing him to hire a lawyer the family couldn't afford, and by the time he finally won, the medical bills had consumed any benefit the settlement might have provided. Now Rebecca was alone. Her mother had passed when she was 12, taken by breast cancer that went undiagnosed too long because the family couldn't afford regular doctor visits. Her older brother, Marcus, had left for the army at 18 and never came back, settling in North Carolina with his own family. He sent cards at Christmas and called on birthdays, but made it clear he'd escaped these mountains and had no intention of returning. That left Rebecca as the sole keeper of the Thornfield legacy, such as it was. She worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. 6 mornings a week, she served breakfast and lunch at Millie's Diner in town, a 30-minute drive down the mountain on roads that became nearly impassable during winter. The tips weren't much, but Millie let her take home leftover food, which meant Rebecca ate better than she otherwise could afford. For evenings a week, she cleaned the Mercer County Courthouse and the attached county offices. It was solitary work that paid $12 an hour, good money for the area, but it meant she didn't get home until after 10 most nights. By the time she tended to the chickens, checked the small garden plot, and fell into bed, she barely had energy to sleep, let alone dream. The homestead itself was falling apart faster than she could repair it. The roof needed replacing. She'd patched it 3 times already this year, but it was a losing battle. The porch steps were rotting. The barn was one strong wind away from collapse. The fencing had deteriorated to the point that she couldn't keep livestock, not that she could afford any anyway. Property taxes were due in 2 months, and Rebecca was $800 short. $800 might as well have been $8 million. She'd considered selling off some of the acreage, but there were no buyers for mountain land so steep and exhausted. The only people with money in Mercer County were the Blackwood family, and they had a reputation for buying distressed properties at pennies on the dollar, then sitting on them for generations. Rebecca had sworn she'd let the land go to tax auction before she'd sell to the Blackwoods. But time was running out, and pride didn't pay bills. An unexpected detour. That Saturday morning, Rebecca had planned to spend her rare day off splitting firewood for winter. The forecast called for an early cold snap, and she needed to build up her woodpile before the real cold arrived. She'd risen before dawn, made coffee on her grandmother's old percolator, and was heading to the woodshed when she spotted something unusual on the dirt road that passed near her property. A hand-painted sign, crudely lettered but impossible to miss: estate sale, livestock and equipment, everything must go, Castleman Farm, today only. Rebecca knew the Castleman place. It was about 8 miles east, deeper into the mountains, accessible only by a network of logging roads that most people avoided. Harlan Castleman had been something of a local legend, a hermit who'd lived alone for decades, running a small menagerie of exotic animals he'd somehow acquired over the years. Kids in the area had grown up on stories about the crazy old man with the llamas and peacocks and strange creatures nobody could identify. Harlan had died 3 months ago at age 89, and apparently his distant relatives were finally liquidating the estate. Rebecca normally wouldn't have given it a second thought. She couldn't afford to buy anything, and she certainly didn't need more animals to feed. But something pulled at her, an inexplicable feeling that she should go, just to see. Later, she would wonder about that impulse. Whether it was intuition, fate, or simply the human tendency to be drawn to unusual things. Whatever the reason, she found herself climbing into her weathered Ford F-150 and heading toward the Castleman property instead of toward her woodpile. The drive took nearly 45 minutes, navigating dirt roads that deteriorated from rough to barely passable. Twice Rebecca had to ford small creeks where bridges had washed out years ago. The mountains rose steeply on both sides, their slopes covered in a mix of hardwoods showing their autumn colors and the dark green of evergreens. This was old mountain country, the kind of place where families had lived in isolation for generations, where roads were afterthoughts and the nearest neighbor might be 3 miles away by foot trail. It was the kind of place that bred both resilience and eccentricity in equal measure. When she finally arrived at the Castleman farm, Rebecca was surprised by how many vehicles were already there. At least 24 pickups and SUVs lined the overgrown driveway and spilled onto the surrounding grass. Apparently, word of the estate sale had spread, and people had come from all over the county to see what strange treasures old Harlan had left behind. The property itself was larger than Rebecca had expected, maybe 60 or 70 acres, with most of it heavily wooded. The house was a sprawling structure that had clearly been added onto multiple times over the decades, creating an architectural hodgepodge that somehow worked despite violating every principle of coherent design. Several large outbuildings and animal enclosures dotted the property, some well-maintained and others on the verge of collapse. A temporary tent had been set up near the largest barn, and that's where the auctioneer was holding court. He was a rotund man in his 50s wearing a cowboy hat despite having probably never been west of the Mississippi, his voice amplified by a portable PA system as he worked through the lots at a rapid pace. Rebecca wandered through the crowd, listening to the bidding with half an ear while observing the eclectic mix of items and animals being sold. There were llamas that went for surprisingly high prices, several exotic birds that collectors snapped up immediately, farm equipment in various states of disrepair, and countless boxes of miscellaneous items that might contain treasures or trash depending on the buyer's perspective. She recognized some of the people from town, farmers looking for equipment, collectors hoping for bargains, and curiosity seekers who'd come for the spectacle. But there were also outsiders, people whose expensive clothes and new vehicles marked them as coming from somewhere with more money. And then she saw him. The forgotten creature. At the far edge of the property, well away from the main auction activity, sat a small pen that most people seemed to be overlooking. Rebecca only noticed it because she'd wandered away from the crowd, drawn by a weathered wooden sign that read Animal Sanctuary, Harlan's Special Friends. The pen was crude but sturdy, built from rough-cut lumber and enclosed with welded wire fencing. Inside stood the most pathetic miniature donkey Rebecca had ever seen. He couldn't have been more than 30 inches tall at the shoulder, significantly smaller than the standard miniature donkeys she'd occasionally seen at county fairs. His coat was a mottled gray-brown that might have been handsome if it had been properly groomed, but instead was matted and tangled with burrs and debris. His hooves were overgrown, causing him to stand awkwardly. His ribs showed beneath his unkempt fur, evidence of either inadequate feeding or recent illness. But it was his eyes that captured Rebecca's attention. Large, dark, and impossibly expressive, they held an intelligence that seemed out of place in such a small, neglected creature. He watched her approach with what appeared to be cautious hope, as if he'd been disappointed too many times to fully trust but couldn't quite give up on the possibility of kindness. "Hey there, little one," Rebecca said softly, approaching the fence slowly so as not to startle him. The donkey took a tentative step toward her, then another, until he was close enough that Rebecca could reach through the fence to gently touch his nose. His fur was coarser than she'd expected, but he leaned into her touch with an almost desperate neediness that broke her heart. "You've had a rough time, haven't you?" As she stood there, Rebecca noticed something unusual about the donkey's coloring. What she'd initially taken for random patches of lighter fur were actually distinct patterns, white markings that formed intricate designs across his back and sides. They weren't the typical coloring patterns she'd seen on other donkeys or horses. These looked almost deliberately arranged, like someone had painted symbols on him. The markings formed lines and angles that intersected in geometric patterns. Some areas had clusters of small white spots, while others showed longer streaks that crossed his body from shoulder to flank. The most prominent marking was on his back, where white fur created what looked like a rough cross or X shape, with additional lines radiating outward. "Interesting, isn't he?" Rebecca turned to find an elderly woman standing behind her, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick that looked like it had been cut from a mountain ash tree. The woman had to be at least 80 years old, with deeply lined skin that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors and silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes, though, were sharp and alert, missing nothing. "I didn't hear you come up," Rebecca said. "I move quiet," the woman replied with a slight smile. "Learned it from my grandfather, who learned it from his grandfather, back when Cherokee still walked these mountains freely. I'm Evelyn Whitaker. You're Douglas Thornfield's daughter, aren't you?" "Rebecca?" "Yes, ma'am," Rebecca replied, somewhat surprised to be recognized. "Did you know my father?" "Knew him, knew your grandfather, knew your great-grandfather too. I'm 93 years old, child. I've known just about everyone who ever lived in these mountains." Evelyn gestured toward the donkey. "What do you think of Harlan's little prophet?" "Prophet?" "That's what Harlan called him. Got him from a traveling circus that went bankrupt about 17 years ago. Circus was passing through on its way to bankruptcy in Charlotte when they stopped here, desperate to offload animals they couldn't afford to keep. Harlan took in several creatures nobody else wanted." Rebecca looked at the donkey with renewed interest. "Why did he call him Prophet?" Evelyn's expression grew complicated, a mixture of amusement and something darker. "Harlan said the donkey had a gift for knowing things. Claimed he could read the land, find water, sense danger. Most folks thought it was just an old hermit's foolishness, especially after Harlan started talking about other things." "What other things?" The old woman was quiet for a moment, studying Rebecca with those sharp eyes. "You really don't know the history, do you? Your father never told you." "Told me what?" "About why the Thornfields lost half their land in 1935. About the Blackwood family's coal fortune. About what's buried in these mountains that certain people would prefer stayed buried." Evelyn shook her head slowly. "Douglas was trying to protect you, I suppose. Thought if he never spoke of it, you might escape the weight of knowing." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "Mrs. Whitaker, I don't understand what you're talking about." "No, you don't. But you will." Evelyn reached into the pocket of her worn cardigan and withdrew a yellowed piece of paper, carefully folded and obviously very old. Harlan gave this to me 3 weeks before he died. Made me promise to give it to whoever bought profit. He was very specific about that. Said the right person would come, and I'd know who it was. She pressed the paper into Rebecca's hand. Harlan might have been eccentric, but he wasn't crazy. Not in the ways people thought, anyway. He spent 50 years piecing together a puzzle that others gave up on or were too afraid to pursue. Profit was part of his research, part of his obsession with setting things right. I don't. Read the note, Evelyn interrupted. Then decide if you want to bid on that donkey or walk away. Either choice is yours to make, but make it knowing what you're choosing. Before Rebecca could ask anything else, Evelyn Whitaker turned and walked away with surprising speed for someone her age, disappearing around the corner of a barn and leaving Rebecca alone with the note and her questions. With trembling fingers, Rebecca unfolded the paper. The handwriting was shaky but legible, written in faded blue ink. To whoever acquires profit. This animal carries a map to truth that has been hidden for 90 years. The markings on his hide are not natural coloration but deliberate patterns I transferred from the original documents before they were stolen from my home in 1998. The Blackwood family built their fortune on theft and murder. In 1933, they orchestrated the collapse of the Mercer Mountain Mining Cooperative, a collective operation owned by 23 local families including the Thornfields, Whitakers, Castlemans, and others. When the cooperative struck the richest vein of anthracite coal ever found in these mountains, the Blackwoods used their political connections and outright violence to force a bankruptcy that left the cooperative families with nothing while the Blackwoods claimed the entire operation. The cooperative's leaders, including my grandfather Silas Castleman, hid documentation of the true ownership and the location of the main vein in case they could someday reclaim what was stolen. That documentation was passed down through my family until it was taken from me by people working for the Blackwoods. But I had already transferred the critical information onto Profit's hide using a special vegetable dye that altered his hair follicles permanently. The map is complete. The coordinates are accurate. The proof exists where the map leads. If you are reading this, you are meant to finish what I could not. Follow the map when the sun is at its highest point and the shadows are shortest. The truth has been buried long enough. The Blackwood family owes a debt to these mountains and the families they destroyed. Profit will lead the righteous to reclaim what was taken. Harlan Castleman, July 15, 2024 inch. Rebecca read the note 3 times, her mind reeling. This was impossible. It had to be the rambling of a delusional old man, the kind of conspiracy theory that isolated people sometimes develop to make sense of their lives. But something in the specificity of it, in the careful detail, gave her pause. Her father had rarely spoken of his family's history beyond general stories about his grandfather and great-grandfather. But she remembered one conversation, late at night during his final months when the pain medication made him more talkative than usual. He'd mentioned that the Thornfields had once owned twice as much land, that there had been some kind of business arrangement that went wrong in the 1930s, that the family had never fully recovered. He'd been vague, and Rebecca had assumed it was just the confused memories of a dying man. Now she wondered if there had been more to it, if her father had deliberately kept things from her. She looked at the miniature donkey, who was watching her with those intelligent eyes. The white markings across his hide suddenly seemed more significant, less random. A map. Could it really be a map? The rational part of Rebecca's mind said this was ridiculous. Even if there had been some kind of mining dispute 90 years ago, what could possibly be done about it now? And the idea that a donkey's coat pattern could be a deliberately created map seemed like something from a fantasy novel, not reality. But the other part of her mind, the part that had been raised on these mountains where folklore and reality often intertwined, where old families kept secrets and grudges for generations, where the landscape itself seemed to remember things that people tried to forget, that part of her wondered. What if it was true? What if there was something to reclaim, something that could lift the weight of poverty that had pressed down on her family for generations? And even if it was nonsense, what harm could come from spending a quarter on a neglected donkey who needed help? The 25-cent gamble. Rebecca made her way back to the main auction area, still holding the note from Harlan Castleman. The auctioneer was working through farm equipment now, selling off old tractors and implements that had seen better days. The crowd had thinned slightly as people who'd gotten what they wanted drifted away. She waited, watching the lots go by, until finally the auctioneer seemed to be running out of major items. He consulted with a younger man who appeared to be managing the estate, and there was a brief discussion before he picked up his microphone again. "All right folks, we're getting down to the end here. Just a few more lots to clear out. Lot number 73 is a miniature donkey, located in the pen out by the east barn. Animal is in as-is condition, age approximately 17 years old according to the records we found. We'll start the bidding at $20. Silence. Most of the remaining crowd was browsing through boxes of household items, not paying attention. $10? $5? Nothing. Come on now, folks. Even if you don't want the animal, donkey meat is perfectly edible. Gotta be worth at least the processing cost." Rebecca felt her stomach turn at the casual mention of killing the donkey for meat. She knew it was a practical consideration in mountain communities where nothing went to waste, but the thought of profit ending up that way made her sick. $1, the auctioneer tried, his tone becoming exasperated. 50 cents? Still no response. People were either not interested or actively avoiding making eye contact with the auctioneer, not wanting to get stuck with an unwanted animal. The auctioneer sighed heavily. "All right, 25 cents. That's my final offer before we move on. Who'll give me a quarter for this donkey?" Rebecca's hand went up before she fully processed what she was doing. "Sold to the young lady in the back for 25 cents. The auctioneer's relief was palpable. "Congratulations, ma'am. See the estate manager to collect your property. Next lot." Rebecca barely heard the rest, her heart pounding as the reality of what she'd done sank in. She'd just purchased a donkey. A donkey she had no place to keep, no way to transport, and no money to feed. But as she made her way to the estate manager's table to pay her quarter and sign the transfer paperwork, she felt an unexpected sense of rightness about the decision. If nothing else, she'd saved profit from an ignominious end. The estate manager, a harried-looking man in his 40s with a clipboard and an air of wanting to be anywhere else, barely glanced at her as she handed over her quarter and signed the necessary papers. "You'll need to remove the animal from the property today," he said mechanically. "We're locking the gates at 5 p.m. After that, anything left behind becomes property of the county." "I understand," Rebecca said. "I just need to figure out transportation. There's a livestock trailer in lot 81 if you're interested. Might go cheap since most folks have already left." Rebecca thanked him and made her way back to Prophet's pen, her mind already working on the logistics. She had her pickup truck, but no trailer. She'd need to bid on one if she could afford it, or rig up some way to secure Prophet in the truck bed, which seemed dangerous for both of them. When she reached the pen, she found Prophet standing near the gate, almost as if he'd been waiting for her. The donkey made a soft sound, not quite a bray but something gentler, and walked right up to where she stood. "Well, little one, looks like we're in this together now," Rebecca said, reaching through the fence to stroke his nose. "I'm probably crazy, and you're probably just a miniature donkey with unusual coloring. But we're going to find out, aren't we?" She studied the markings on his hide more carefully now, trying to see if there was any pattern she could recognize. In the late morning sunlight, the white fur stood out starkly against the darker base color. The lines did seem deliberate, forming what could be interpreted as paths or roads. The clusters of spots might represent landmarks or specific locations. If she squinted and let her mind make connections, it almost looked like the topography of mountains, ridges and valleys, waterways and peaks. But that was probably just pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns in random information. People saw faces in clouds, religious figures in toast, and meaning in chaos. Wasn't she just doing the same thing with a donkey's coat pattern? The auction continued behind her, but Rebecca tuned it out, focused on profit and the decision she'd just made. Her practical side was screaming that this was foolish, that she'd just added another mouth to feed when she could barely feed herself. But some other part of her, deeper and harder to name, felt like she'd just taken the first step on a path that had been waiting for her to find it. Rebecca Thornfield? She turned to find a man approaching the pen. He was in his 60s, dressed in expensive casual clothes that marked him as someone from outside the mountains, pressed khakis, a polo shirt with a golf club logo, and leather shoes that had probably never touched actual dirt before today. "Yes," she replied wearily. "My name is Gerald Whitmore. I represent the Blackwood Development Corporation." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I happened to overhear that you just purchased the miniature donkey." "I did." "Why?" "The Blackwood family has a long-standing interest in preserving local heritage and history. Mr. Castleman and my employer had a complicated relationship, but the Blackwoods respect his memory and would like to ensure his animals are properly cared for." "That's thoughtful," Rebecca said carefully, sensing there was more coming. "Indeed. Which is why I'm authorized to offer you $1,000 for the donkey. Cash, right now, no paperwork beyond a simple bill of sale. We'll take care of removing the animal, and you'll walk away with a very nice profit on your 25-cent investment." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. $1,000 for a neglected miniature donkey that nobody else had wanted? The offer was so disproportionate to the animal's apparent value that it immediately raised red flags. Why would the Blackwood family pay that much for this particular donkey? Gerald's smile remained fixed. "As I said, they're interested in preserving Mr. Castleman's legacy. The donkey was apparently one of his favorites. Then why didn't they bid on him during the auction?" "We only just learned about the estate sale," Gerald said smoothly. "By the time our representative arrived, the auction had already concluded." Rebecca looked at Prophet, then back at Gerald. The man's explanation was plausible but felt wrong. And the fact that he'd approached her within minutes of her purchase, offering an absurdly high price, suggested that the Blackwood family had been watching the auction specifically for this donkey. Which meant Harlan Castleman's note might not be the ravings of a paranoid old man after all. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Whitmore, but I'm going to keep him." Gerald's smile faltered. "Miss Thornfield, I don't think you understand. $1,000 is more than generous for a—" "I said no. He's not for sale." "5,000. Gerald's tone had shifted, becoming harder. "Final offer. $5,000. Rebecca's entire year's income from both her jobs. Enough to pay her property taxes with plenty left over. Enough to fix her roof and her porch and maybe even save some for winter." But the desperation in Gerald's voice, the way his pleasant mask had slipped to reveal something colder underneath, told Rebecca everything she needed to know. Whatever Harlan Castleman had hidden in Prophet's markings, the Blackwood family was very interested in keeping it hidden. "Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate your concern for the donkey's welfare, but my answer is no. He's mine now, and I plan to take good care of him." Gerald's expression went completely cold. "You're making a mistake, Miss Thornfield. The Blackwood family has been very good to Mercer County for generations. It's not wise to disrespect that relationship over a donkey." "Is that a threat?" "It's friendly advice. These mountains can be dangerous for people who don't understand their place." He produced a business card and set it on the fence post. "When you change your mind, and you will call that number. The offer expires in 7 days. After that, the Blackwood family's interest in your welfare expires as well." He walked away without waiting for a response, leaving Rebecca standing alone with her new donkey and a growing certainty that she'd just stumbled into something far more complicated than she'd imagined. The sun was past its zenith now, beginning its afternoon descent. Rebecca looked at Prophet, who was watching her with those impossibly intelligent eyes. "What secrets are you carrying, little one?" she whispered. "And what am I getting myself into?" Prophet made that soft sound again and pressed his nose against her hand. Whatever was coming, whatever truth Harlan Castleman had hidden in the donkey's markings, Rebecca had just committed herself to discovering it. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she heard her father's voice from years ago, warning her that Thornfield women had always been too stubborn for their own good. For better or worse, she was about to prove him right. The afternoon sun was well past its peak by the time Rebecca managed to secure transportation for profit. She'd ended up purchasing the livestock trailer Gerald Whitmore had mentioned, a rusty but functional 2-horse trailer that went for $80 after most buyers had already left. Combined with her quarter for profit, she'd spent $80.25, which represented nearly a week's worth of tips from the diner. Loading profit into the trailer proved surprisingly easy. The small donkey walked up the ramp without hesitation, as if eager to leave the Castleman property behind. Rebecca secured him with a makeshift halter she'd fashioned from rope she kept in her truck's toolbox, making sure he had enough slack to move comfortably but not enough to hurt himself during the journey. As she prepared to leave, she noticed a black SUV with tinted windows parked near the estate entrance. It hadn't been there earlier. Though she couldn't see who was inside, Rebecca had the distinct feeling she was being watched. She thought of Gerald Whitmore's thinly veiled threat and felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. The drive back to her homestead took nearly an hour, complicated by the trailer's tendency to sway on the rough mountain roads. Rebecca drove carefully, hyper-aware of her precious cargo. She kept checking her rearview mirror, half expecting to see the black SUV following, but the road behind her remained empty. By the time she pulled into her property, the sun was low on the horizon, painting the mountains in shades of gold and amber. Rebecca's homestead looked even more dilapidated in the beautiful light, the sagging roof, the weathered siding, the general air of neglect that came from having too much property and too little resources to maintain it. But right now, none of that mattered. She had more pressing concerns. Rebecca unloaded Profit and led him to the small paddock area adjacent to her barn. It wasn't much, just a quarter-acre of relatively flat ground surrounded by split-rail fencing that was more decorative than functional at this point. But it would do for now. She'd put fresh straw in the lean-to shelter that morning before leaving, originally intended for the firewood she'd planned to stack. Now it would serve as Profit's temporary housing. The miniature donkey explored his new surroundings with cautious curiosity, sniffing at the ground, testing the water in the old metal trough Rebecca had filled, and eventually settling near the shelter with a contented sigh that made Rebecca smile despite her anxieties. "Welcome home, Profit," she said softly. "It's not much, but it's safe." As darkness descended and the first stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, Rebecca stood by the fence watching her unexpected acquisition. Profit had settled down on the straw, his small form barely visible in the gathering darkness. The white markings on his hide seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, those mysterious patterns that might be nothing more than unusual coloring or might be the key to a century-old secret. Rebecca pulled out her phone and took several photos, using the flash to capture the markings from different angles. The camera's flash created stark contrasts between the white markings and the darker base coat, making the patterns even more distinct. She took dozens of shots, moving around Profit's pen to document every angle, every detail. The donkey tolerated her photography session with patient resignation, occasionally turning to watch her with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than an animal should. When she finally went inside, exhausted but too keyed up to sleep, Rebecca spread the photos across her kitchen table and studied them alongside Harlan Castleman's note. She also retrieved an old topographical map of Mercer County from her father's desk. He'd kept detailed maps of the area from his mining days, marking tunnels and seams and geological features. Decoding the map. For hours, Rebecca compared Profit's markings to the topographical map, trying to see if there was any correlation. At first, it seemed hopeless. The white patterns on the donkey looked nothing like the contour lines and symbols on the map. She was about to give up, convinced she was seeing patterns where none existed, when she noticed something odd. One of the photos she'd taken showed Profit from directly above, looking down on his back. In this angle, with the flash creating shadows, the white markings formed something that did resemble a map, but not a modern topographical map. It looked more like an old hand-drawn map, the kind miners might have sketched in the early 1900s before sophisticated surveying equipment. Rebecca grabbed a piece of tracing paper and a pencil. Carefully, she began tracing the white markings from the photo, simplifying them into basic lines and shapes. As she worked, a pattern emerged. The large X-shaped marking on Profit's back seemed to represent a central location, From this point, lines radiated outward in specific directions. Some lines were straight, others curved. Small clusters of white spots might represent landmarks, perhaps rock formations, springs, or other notable features. Rebecca compared her tracing to her father's old map. If she rotated her tracing slightly and assumed the X was somewhere in the eastern portion of the county, near the old Mercer Mountain area where her family's land was located. Her breath caught. The lines matched. Not perfectly, but close enough that it couldn't be coincidence. One line followed what looked like the course of Blackberry Creek. Another aligned with an old logging road that ran along the ridge above her property. A third matched the direction of an abandoned mining road that her father had told her about years ago. And the X, if Rebecca's interpretation was correct, the X marked a location about 3 miles into the mountains from her eastern property line, in an area that was now part of the Blackwood family's vast holdings but had once been part of the Mercer Mountain Mining Cooperative. Rebecca sat back, her heart pounding. It was real. Harlan Castleman hadn't been delusional. He'd somehow encoded an actual map onto Prophet's hide, and that map pointed to a specific location in the mountains. But what was there? The note had mentioned documentation of ownership, proof that the Blackwood family had stolen the mining cooperative. Was that what was hidden? Papers proving a 90-year-old theft? And if so, what good would they do now? Surely any legal claims would have expired decades ago. You couldn't just walk into court with old documents and reclaim property that had changed hands 3 generations ago. Could you? Rebecca realized she was way out of her depth. She needed help, someone who understood mining history, property law, and the complicated politics of Mercer County. But who could she trust? The Blackwood family seemed to have eyes everywhere, and their reach extended throughout the county's power structure. She thought of Evelyn Whitaker, the elderly woman who'd given her Harlan's note. Evelyn was 93 years old, which meant she'd been a child during the mining cooperative collapse. She might remember things, know things, that had been forgotten or deliberately obscured. Rebecca made a decision. Tomorrow was Sunday, her one day completely off from both jobs. She would visit Evelyn Whitaker and try to learn more about the history that Harlan Castleman had spent 50 years investigating. Sunday morning visitor. Rebecca was up before dawn, unable to sleep with her mind racing through possibilities and implications. She fed Prophet, noting that the little donkey seemed much more energetic after a night of rest and proper food. She'd given him grain from her chicken feed, not ideal, but better than nothing, and he'd eaten eagerly. As she was finishing her own breakfast of black coffee and toast, she heard a vehicle approaching. Rebecca tensed, remembering the black SUV from yesterday. She went to the window and was relieved to see not a SUV but an old Jeep Cherokee, at least 20 years old and covered in a patchwork of rust and primer spots. Evelyn Whitaker emerged from the driver's side with surprising spryness for someone her age. She wore practical mountain clothing, jeans, boots, and a flannel shirt, and carried a canvas bag over one shoulder. Rebecca opened the door before Evelyn could knock. "Mrs. Whitaker. I was actually planning to come see you today." "I know," the old woman said matter-of-factly. "That's why I came here instead. Saved us both the trip. May I come in?" Rebecca stepped aside, and Evelyn entered, her sharp eyes taking in everything about the humble kitchen, the worn linoleum, the ancient appliances, the general air of making do with too little. If she was judging, though, it didn't show on her face. "You bought the donkey," Evelyn said, settling into one of the kitchen chairs without waiting for an invitation. "And the Blackwood family already approached you about buying him back." It wasn't a question. Rebecca nodded. "How did you know?" "Because they've been waiting for 20 years for Harlan to die so they could get their hands on that donkey. They had people at the estate sale specifically watching for anyone who showed interest in Prophet. When you bought him, they moved immediately." Evelyn set her canvas bag on the table. "The fact that you're still here, and the donkey is still yours, tells me you refused their offer. Which means you either believe Harlan's note, or you're too stubborn for your own good." "Maybe both," Rebecca admitted. She poured coffee for Evelyn without asking, and the old woman accepted it with a nod of thanks. "Your father was the same way," Evelyn said. "Stubborn. Loyal to these mountains even when they broke him. He knew about the mining cooperative, about what the Blackwoods did. But he was too tired, too sick, too beaten down by life to do anything about it. I think part of him hoped you'd never have to carry that weight." "What exactly did they do?" Rebecca asked, sitting across from Evelyn. "The note mentioned theft and murder, but you want the whole story." Evelyn took a long sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. "I was 3 years old when it happened, so I don't remember it directly. But my grandfather Josiah Whitaker was one of the founding members of the Mercer Mountain Mining Cooperative, and my father made sure I knew every detail of what happened. In 1929, 23 families pooled their resources to form a mining cooperative. Each family contributed land, equipment, or labor. The Thornfields contributed 60 acres that bordered the eastern ridge. The Whitakers provided surveying expertise and initial capital. The Castlemans brought mining equipment and experience. And so on. For 3 years, they worked together, sharing profits equally, building something real. Then in 1932, they struck the mother lode, the richest vein of anthracite coal anyone had ever seen in these mountains. We're talking millions of dollars worth, maybe tens of millions in today's money." Evelyn's expression darkened. The cooperative leaders decided to keep the discovery quiet until they could secure proper mining rights and legal protections. But somehow, the Blackwood family found out. Jackson Blackwood was the patriarch back then, a ruthless man who'd already built a small fortune through timber and smaller coal operations. He wanted that vein. What happened next depends on who tells the story. The official version, the one in the county records, says the cooperative went bankrupt due to mismanagement and collapsed. Jackson Blackwood bought the assets at auction, along with mineral rights to the land, all perfectly legal. The real version, the one passed down through families like mine, is darker. Jackson used bribes, threats, and violence to force the cooperative apart. 3 men died in accidents that weren't accidents. Several families received threats against their children and chose to leave the county entirely. Others were offered money to sell their shares, money they desperately needed during the Depression. The cooperative's leadership, including my grandfather and your great-great-grandfather Josiah Thornfield, tried to fight back. They had documentation proving the true value of the vein, proving that the bankruptcy was manufactured, proving that Jackson Blackwood had engaged in fraud and possibly murder. But before they could present their evidence to authorities outside the county, the documents disappeared. Someone broke into your great-great-grandfather's house and took them. Similar break-ins happened to other families. Without proof, their claims were dismissed as sour grapes from failed businessmen. Jackson Blackwood got everything. The Blackwood Coal Company was born, and it made the family richer than anyone in these mountains had ever been. Over the next 90 years, they expanded into other businesses, real estate, banking, development. They became the power in Mercer County, and everyone forgot that their fortune started with theft. Rebecca absorbed this, feeling the weight of history settling on her shoulders. But Harlan Castleman didn't forget. No, he didn't. His grandfather Silas was one of the cooperative leaders, and the loss broke him. He died bitter and poor, but he'd managed to hide some of the documentation. That information was passed down through the Castleman family. When Harlan inherited it in the 1970s, he became obsessed with proving what happened. He spent 50 years gathering evidence, interviewing old-timers, researching county records. He tracked down descendants of the cooperative families who'd left the area. He even hired private investigators to look into the Blackwood family's business practices. And slowly, painstakingly, he pieced together the full story. Evelyn reached into her canvas bag and withdrew a thick folder stuffed with papers. This is everything Harlan gave me before he died. Copies of documents, photographs, witness statements, genealogies connecting the cooperative families to their living descendants. It's not the original proof, that's still hidden where Harlan concealed it 90 years ago. But it's enough to understand what you're looking for. Rebecca opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of documents, some obviously old copies, others more recent. She saw photographs of stern-faced men standing in front of a mine entrance, documents with official seals, hand-drawn maps, and pages of handwritten notes in what must be Harlan's script. The original documentation is hidden at the location marked on Prophet's back, Evelyn continued. Harlan's grandfather Silas and your great-great-grandfather Josiah hid it together in 1933, right before the threats became too severe. They planned to retrieve it once things calmed down, but they never got the chance. Silas died in a mining accident 3 months later. Josiah was forced to sell half his land to cover manufactured debts and spent the rest of his life too afraid to act. The location was passed down through both families, always orally, never written down where it could be found. Harlan was the last person alive who knew exactly where it was hidden. When someone broke into his house in 1998 and stole the maps and documents he'd accumulated, he was devastated. But he was also clever. He'd already been working on a way to preserve the location without creating a document that could be stolen. That's when he acquired Prophet from the circus. Miniature donkeys can live 30 years or more, and their coats have predictable patterns. Harlan used a special vegetable-based dye, he was quite the naturalist, to alter Prophet's hair follicles in specific patterns. As the hair grew out, it came in white instead of the normal color, creating a permanent map. That's... Rebecca struggled for words. That's brilliant. And insane. It's both, Evelyn agreed. But it worked. The Blackwood family has been trying to get their hands on that donkey for 17 years. They've offered Harlan money, threatened him, even tried to steal Prophet twice. But Harlan was paranoid and well prepared. He kept Prophet locked in a secure pen with alarms and cameras. And he never told anyone what the markings meant, not even me, until right before he died. Rebecca looked at the old woman across from her. Why are you helping me? What do you get out of this? Evelyn's laugh was dry and humorless. What do I get? Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. My family lost our land too, Rebecca. The Whitakers once owned 200 acres that's now part of the Blackwood estate. My father worked himself to death trying to buy it back. My brother left these mountains and never returned because there was nothing here for him. I'm 93 years old. I won't live to see whatever justice might come from exposing the Blackwoods. But maybe my grandchildren will benefit. Maybe the dozen or so families still in the county who descended from the cooperative members will get something back. Or maybe this is just about making sure the truth is finally told before everyone who remembers is dead. She stood, leaving the folder on the table. That's all the documentation I have. Study it. Understand what you're looking for and why it matters. Then decide if you're brave enough, or foolish enough, to go get it. The Blackwoods will try to stop me, Rebecca said. Of course they will. They've built an empire on that theft. Revealing the truth threatens their entire legacy, their claim to half the property they own, their reputation. They'll do whatever is necessary to prevent that. Then how can I possibly succeed where Harlan failed for 50 years? Evelyn smiled, and for a moment her ancient face looked almost mischievous. Because Harlan was a hermit who everyone dismissed as crazy. You're a Thornfield, from a family that everyone knows and respects. More importantly, you're young, you understand technology, and you're desperate enough to take risks Harlan wouldn't. Plus, you have something he didn't. What's that? Time pressure. Your property taxes are due in 2 months, aren't they? If you don't pay them, you lose the Thornfield homestead. The Blackwoods will buy it at auction, like they've done with a dozen other distressed properties. But if you can get that documentation and make it public, you might be able to stop them. You might even be able to reclaim what your family lost. Rebecca felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. This is impossible. Probably, Evelyn agreed. But sometimes impossible things need to be attempted anyway. Harlan thought you were the right person to finish what he started. I'm inclined to agree. The question is, do you agree? After Evelyn left, Rebecca spent the rest of the morning poring over the documents in the folder. The story they told was both more detailed and more damning than Evelyn's summary had suggested. She found testimony from a nurse who'd treated one of the cooperative members before he died, claiming he'd been poisoned. There were bank records showing suspicious transfers from cooperative accounts to shell companies controlled by Jackson Blackwood. There were photographs of threatening letters sent to families who refused to sell their shares. Most compelling was a partial transcript of a conversation between Jackson Blackwood and one of his associates, recorded somehow in 1933 and transcribed by Harlan decades later when he'd found the original recording. In it, Jackson explicitly discussed using any means necessary to acquire the cooperative's assets and mentioned that accidents can be arranged for anyone who caused too much trouble. It was damning evidence of conspiracy and possibly murder. But it was all copies, transcripts, and second-hand accounts. Without the original documents that Josiah Thornfield and Silas Castleman had hidden in 1933, it would never hold up in any court. It would be dismissed as conspiracy theory, forged documents, or the obsessive delusions of a hermit who'd spent too much time alone. Rebecca needed those originals. Which meant she needed to follow Prophet's map into the mountains. Planning the expedition. Over the next few days, Rebecca's life took on a strange double nature. During her shifts at the diner and cleaning the courthouse, she went through the motions of normalcy, serving eggs and bacon, mopping floors, and making small talk. But every spare moment was spent planning her expedition into the mountains to find what Harlan Castleman and her ancestors had hidden 90 years ago. She studied Prophet's markings obsessively, comparing them to every map she could find. The pattern was becoming clearer. The X marked a location about 3 miles from her eastern property line, in an area that was heavily forested and had no marked trails. Getting there would require hiking through rough terrain, possibly crossing the Blackwood property line, which was technically trespassing. Rebecca researched what she might need: a good compass, topographical maps, supplies for a full day of hiking, maybe camping equipment if it took longer than expected. She'd grown up in these mountains and knew how to navigate, but she'd never attempted anything quite like this. She also became aware that she was being watched. The black SUV appeared periodically, parked along the road near her property or following at a distance when she drove to work. When she mentioned it to her boss at the diner, Millie just shook her head knowingly. "Blackwood Security," Millie said. "They keep tabs on anyone they're interested in. Been doing it for years. My cousin had them following her for weeks after she wrote a letter to the county commissioner complaining about their mining runoff contaminating her well water. Is that legal? Probably not. But who's going to stop them? They own the sheriff's department, half the county council, and most of the lawyers in town. You'd have to go to the state authorities, and by then they've discontinued their surveillance." Millie studied Rebecca with concern. "What did you do to attract their attention?" "Bought a donkey they wanted." Millie laughed, then stopped when she realized Rebecca was serious. "You're not joking." "I wish I was." "Sugar, if the Blackwoods want something from you, my advice is to give it to them. Those people don't take no for an answer, and they have long memories. My cousin ended up moving to Ohio just to get away from the harassment. But Rebecca couldn't give them Prophet. Not now, when she was so close to understanding what the miniature donkey represented. Not when she had a chance, however slim, of uncovering the truth about her family's history and maybe, just maybe, saving her home. On Wednesday evening, as Rebecca was leaving the courthouse after her cleaning shift, she found Gerald Whitmore waiting by her truck in the parking lot. He was leaning against her driver's door, arms crossed, his expensive clothes looking out of place in the dim light of the parking lot. "Miss Thornfield," he said pleasantly, though his eyes were cold. "I thought we might have another conversation about your donkey. I told you, he's not for sale." "Yes, and I respected that answer. Initially. But it's been 4 days now, and I'm concerned that you don't fully understand the situation you're in." Rebecca kept her distance, keys in hand. "What situation is that?" "You owe $800 in property taxes, due in less than 2 months. You're working 2 jobs and barely making ends meet. Winter is coming, and your house needs significant repairs to be safe in the cold months." Gerald smiled without warmth. The Blackwood family could solve all those problems with one check. All we want is a miniature donkey that has no practical value to you. If he has no value, why do you want him so badly? Sentimental reasons. Mr. Blackwood has fond memories of visiting Mr. Castleman as a child and seeing the donkey. He'd like to preserve that memory. It was such an obvious lie that Rebecca almost laughed. Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but my answer remains the same. Profit is not for sale at any price. Gerald's pleasant mask slipped entirely. You're being foolish, Miss Thornfield. The Blackwood family has been very patient with you, but that patience has limits. It would be unfortunate if your property taxes went unpaid and you lost your home. It would be even more unfortunate if your employers decided they no longer required your services. Or if your truck failed its next inspection due to safety violations. Or if... Are you threatening me? Rebecca interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I'm explaining reality. This county runs on relationships and goodwill. The Blackwood family has a great deal of influence over who prospers and who struggles. You'd be wise to consider that before you continue this stubborn refusal. He pushed off from her truck and walked toward his own vehicle, a luxury sedan parked nearby. Before getting in, he turned back. My offer remains open for 3 more days. After that, the Blackwood family will consider this matter closed and will act accordingly. I suggest you make the right choice. As he drove away, Rebecca stood in the empty parking lot, shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. The threat was clear: sell the donkey or face economic retaliation that would destroy her life in this county. But what Gerald Whitmore didn't understand was that Rebecca had already lost almost everything that mattered. Her parents were dead. Her brother had abandoned the mountains. Her home was falling apart. She had nothing left to lose except her pride and her integrity. And those, she decided, were worth fighting for. That night, Rebecca made her final preparations. She would go into the mountains on Sunday, her next day off. She would follow Prophet's map to wherever it led. She would find what Harlan Castleman and her ancestors had hidden 90 years ago. And whatever happened after that, at least she would know the truth. As she stood in Prophet's paddock, studying the markings on his hide by flashlight one more time, the little donkey nuzzled her hand gently. His dark eyes reflected the light, intelligent and patient, as if he understood the journey they were about to take together. Ready for an adventure, Prophet? Rebecca whispered. The donkey made his soft, almost musical sound, and Rebecca chose to interpret it as agreement. Sunday was 4 days away. For days to prepare, to study the maps, to gather supplies, and to build her courage for what she was about to attempt. For days before everything would change. Rebecca woke before dawn on Sunday, her stomach tight with anticipation and fear. She'd spent the previous 4 days meticulously preparing for this expedition, gathering supplies and studying every detail of Prophet's map until she could visualize the route in her sleep. Her backpack sat by the door, carefully packed with essentials: water bottles, energy bars, a first aid kit, her father's old compass, topographical maps with her planned route marked in pencil, a flashlight with extra batteries, rope, and a small camping shovel. She'd also packed her phone, though she knew the signal would be non-existent deep in the mountains, and a portable charger just in case. Most importantly, she'd brought her father's old camera, a sturdy digital SLR that he'd used to document mining sites before his illness. Whatever she found in the mountains, she needed photographic evidence that couldn't be questioned or dismissed. As the first gray light of dawn began to soften the darkness, Rebecca went out to Prophet's paddock. The miniature donkey was already awake, standing alert as if he'd been waiting for her. She'd made a decision during her planning: she would bring Prophet with her. The map was on his hide, and having him present would make navigation easier. More than that, something told her that Prophet belonged on this journey, that Harlan Castleman had intended for the donkey to be there when the truth was finally uncovered. Ready for an adventure, little one? She asked, fitting him with the rope halter. Prophet responded with his soft, musical sound and followed her willingly as she led him from the paddock. She'd fashioned a makeshift lead from strong rope, long enough to give him freedom to navigate the terrain but short enough to maintain control. The early morning air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Frost glittered on the grass, and Rebecca's breath came out in visible puffs. It was going to be a beautiful autumn day, clear skies, mild temperatures, perfect conditions for a mountain hike. If only she were going for pleasure instead of pursuing a 90-year-old mystery that powerful people wanted to keep buried. Rebecca locked her house, though she had nothing worth stealing, and began walking east across her property. The first mile was easy, following the old fence line that marked the edge of the Thornfield land. Prophet walked beside her with surprising stamina for such a small creature, his short legs moving quickly to keep pace. As they walked, Rebecca reviewed her plan. According to her interpretation of Prophet's map, she needed to reach the eastern ridge, then follow it north for approximately 2 miles until she reached a distinctive rock formation that looked like a split boulder. From there, she'd head northeast into a valley, following what should be an old creek bed, until she reached the location marked by the X. Rebecca's hands shook as she crawled into the stone structure. The space smelled of earth and old stone, but there was no sense of decay or danger. It had been built well, designed to last, and the mountainside had protected it for 9 decades. The metal box was old-fashioned, the kind that might have been used for storing important documents in the early 1900s. It was locked with a simple padlock that had rusted nearly solid. Rebecca used a rock to smash the lock, her blows echoing in the small space. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth that had miraculously kept out moisture, were documents. Rebecca carefully removed them and carried them outside into the daylight. Prophet watched intently as she unwrapped the oilcloth and began examining what her ancestors had hidden here. The first document was a ledger, handwritten in meticulous script. It detailed the formation of the Mercer Mountain Mining Cooperative in 1929, listing all 23 founding families and their contributions. The Thornfields had contributed 60 acres of mineral-rich land. The Whitakers had provided surveying equipment and initial capital investment. The Castlemans had brought mining expertise and equipment. Each family's contribution and ownership percentage was carefully documented. Each member had signed, their signatures witnessed and dated. The second document was a surveyor's report from 1932, describing the discovery of the most significant anthracite coal deposit yet found in the Mercer Mountain region, estimated value in excess of $2 million at current market prices. $2 million in 1932 money. Rebecca did quick mental math, that would be worth perhaps 30 or 40 million today, maybe more. And that was just the initial estimate. The vein could have produced far more over the decades it had been mined by the Blackwood family. The third document was the most damning, a contract dated January 1933, showing Jackson Blackwood's offer to purchase the cooperative for $50,000, less than 3% of its actual value. The cooperative board had unanimously rejected the offer, their refusal documented and signed. But there was more. Tucked behind the contract were letters, correspondence between Jackson Blackwood and his attorney discussing strategies for acquiring the cooperative by any means necessary. One letter explicitly mentioned that arrangements can be made for key members to meet with unfortunate accidents, and another discussed bribing the county assessor to declare the cooperative in default of property taxes. Rebecca's hands shook as she photographed each document carefully, taking multiple shots from different angles to ensure clarity. This was proof. Actual, physical proof of conspiracy, fraud, and premeditated murder. The fourth document was a detailed map of the coal vein, showing its extent and estimated yield. Someone, probably Silas Castleman, given his surveying expertise, had marked the vein's location with precise coordinates and measurements. The map showed that the vein extended under land that was part of the cooperative's collective holdings, including the 60 acres contributed by the Thornfield family. According to this map, the richest part of the vein ran directly under what was now the Blackwood family's primary mining operation. The final document was a handwritten statement, signed by all the cooperative board members, dated March 1933. We, the undersigned, being of sound mind and body, do hereby attest that the Mercer Mountain Mining Cooperative was illegally dissolved through fraud, intimidation, and violence perpetrated by Jackson Blackwood and his associates. We have hidden this documentation in a secure location to preserve evidence of the true ownership of the mineral rights and the crimes committed against our families. Should any of us meet untimely deaths, this evidence will prove that Jackson Blackwood is responsible. We pray that justice will eventually be served, even if we do not live to see it. Below this statement were 23 signatures, including Josiah Thornfield and Silas Castleman. Rebecca sat back, overwhelmed by what she'd found. This was more than she'd hoped for. This was ironclad evidence of a conspiracy that had shaped the economic landscape of Mercer County for 90 years. This could change everything. But as she was repacking the documents, Prophet suddenly brayed loudly, the first real bray she'd heard from him. It was a warning sound, sharp and alarmed. Rebecca looked up to find 3 men entering the clearing from the rhododendron tunnel she'd come through. One of them was Gerald Whitmore. The other 2 were large, hard-looking men in outdoor gear who definitely weren't there for friendly conversation. Confrontation in the mountains. "Miss Thornfield," Gerald said, his voice echoing across the small clearing. "I'm disappointed. I gave you every opportunity to do this the easy way." Rebecca stood slowly, positioning herself between the men and Prophet. Her backpack with the documents was at her feet. "How did you find me? Did you really think we'd let you wander off into the mountains unsupervised? We've been tracking your phone since you left your property. These gentlemen have been following you all morning, staying far enough back that you wouldn't notice." Rebecca's mind raced. Her phone. Of course. Even without signal, it could be tracked by GPS. She'd been so focused on the map and the journey that she'd never thought to leave it behind. "Those documents are the property of the Blackwood family," Gerald continued, moving closer. "They're going to stay buried where they belong. These documents prove your family built their fortune on theft and murder," Rebecca countered, trying to keep her voice steady despite her fear. "They belong to the descendants of the families your great-great-grandfather destroyed. Ancient history. Unprovable allegations. Even if what you're saying were true, it was 90 years ago. No court would act on claims that old." "Maybe not on property claims," Rebecca agreed. "But murder has no statute of limitations. And conspiracy to defraud has a very long legal reach when it involves documented evidence. Plus, there's the court of public opinion. How do you think the Blackwood family's reputation will hold up when the world learns how their fortune really started?" Gerald's pleasant facade cracked completely. "Give me the documents, Miss Thornfield. Last chance." "No." He nodded to one of the men, who started toward her. Rebecca grabbed her backpack and ran. She didn't have a plan beyond getting away, putting distance between herself and the men, and protecting the documents she'd risked everything to find. Prophet galloped beside her, his short legs moving impossibly fast, as they crashed through the clearing toward the creek. Behind her, she heard shouting and the sound of pursuit. The men were larger and stronger, but Rebecca knew these mountains in a way outsiders didn't. She splashed through the creek and scrambled up the opposite bank, Prophet right with her, and plunged into the forest. The undergrowth was thick and treacherous, but it slowed her pursuers as much as it slowed her. Rebecca ran without thinking, her only goal to put distance between herself and danger. Branches whipped at her face, roots tried to trip her, and her lungs burned with exertion. She ran for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, following the slope of the mountain upward instinctively. Higher ground meant better visibility and more options. The sound of pursuit faded behind her, but she didn't dare stop. Finally, gasping for breath and with her legs trembling with exhaustion, Rebecca collapsed behind a massive fallen oak tree. Prophet pressed close to her, his sides heaving. She fumbled for her water bottle and drank deeply, then offered water to Prophet. Her phone. She had to destroy her phone so they couldn't track her. But first. Rebecca pulled out the device and, finding that she miraculously had 1 bar of signal this high on the mountain, frantically typed a message to Evelyn Whitaker. "Found the documents. Everything we needed. Being chased by Blackwood security. If something happens to me, the evidence is in my backpack. Tell the story. Make sure the truth comes out. She hit send, watched the message go through, then immediately removed the battery from her phone and threw the pieces in different directions as far as she could. Without the battery, the phone couldn't be tracked. Now she just had to survive long enough to get these documents to safety. The long way home. Rebecca studied her surroundings, trying to orient herself. The sun was past its zenith, probably early afternoon. She'd run roughly north and uphill, which meant she was somewhere on the ridge system that ran through this part of the mountains. If she could find the ridge top and follow it west, she should eventually intersect with landmarks she recognized. But that meant traveling through unfamiliar territory with no phone, limited water, and people actively hunting for her. "We can do this, Prophet," she whispered to the donkey. "We just need to be smart and careful." They began moving west along the slope, staying below the ridge crest to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. Rebecca moved as quietly as possible, constantly listening for sounds of pursuit. Several times she heard voices or the crack of branches, and each time she and Prophet froze, waiting for the danger to pass. The journey was agonizingly slow. Every 100 yards took 10 or 15 minutes of careful movement, checking sight lines, choosing routes that provided cover. Rebecca's earlier path had been straight and purposeful. This was circuitous and cautious, doubling back when necessary, avoiding open areas. Hours passed. The sun continued its westward arc, and Rebecca knew she was running out of time. She'd hoped to be home before dark, but that was clearly impossible now. She'd be lucky to be off the mountain by nightfall, and traveling these slopes in darkness was incredibly dangerous. As the afternoon wore on, Rebecca began recognizing landmarks. There was the distinctive dead hemlock that stood like a skeletal sentinel on a ridgetop she could see from her property. There was the rock outcropping that looked like a face in profile. She was getting closer to familiar territory. But her water was gone, her energy was fading, and Prophet was moving slower, clearly exhausted by the long day and the stress of their flight. Just a little further, Rebecca encouraged him. "We're almost there." The sun was touching the western horizon when Rebecca finally saw the Thornfield homestead below her. Relief flooded through her, giving her a final burst of energy. They were going to make it. They were going to survive. She began the descent toward her property, less careful now in her eagerness to reach safety. That's when she heard it, the sound of a vehicle engine on the road below. Rebecca froze and watched as a black SUV pulled into her driveway and parked. Gerald Whitmore got out, along with the 2 security men. They'd given up chasing her through the mountains and had simply come here to wait. Of course. They knew she had to come home eventually. Why exhaust themselves in the mountains when they could simply intercept her at her house? Rebecca crouched behind a cluster of mountain laurel and assessed her situation. She couldn't get to her house without being seen. The men were positioned to watch all approaches. As darkness fell, she'd be even more vulnerable, unable to see them while they potentially had night vision equipment. She needed help, but her phone was destroyed. She needed to get the documents to safety, but she couldn't reach her house or her truck. Then she remembered, her nearest neighbor was Samuel Brooks, a widower in his 70s who lived about a mile and a half west. Sam had been friends with her father and had always told Rebecca she could call on him if she needed anything. She'd have to reach Sam's house on foot, in the dark, while exhausted and with a miniature donkey in tow. But it was her only option. The final push. As darkness settled over the mountains, Rebecca began moving west along the slope, paralleling the road but staying well above it where the forest provided cover. Prophet followed gamely despite his exhaustion, and Rebecca felt a surge of affection for the little donkey who'd traveled so far and endured so much. The journey to Sam Brooks's property took nearly 2 hours in the darkness, navigating by starlight and memory. Rebecca moved slowly and carefully, terrified of injury in the dark. Several times she heard vehicles on the road below, the Blackwood security team patrolling, she assumed, looking for any sign of her. When she finally saw lights through the trees ahead, relief nearly buckled her knees. Sam's house was small but well maintained, with a warm glow coming from the windows that represented safety and shelter. Rebecca emerged from the forest and stumbled across Sam's yard to his front door. Prophet collapsed on the porch, completely spent. Rebecca pounded on the door, no longer caring about stealth or caution, just desperate for help. The door opened to reveal Sam Brooks, a wiry man with white hair and a weathered face that showed surprise and then concern as he took in Rebecca's appearance, scratched, dirty, exhausted, and clearly desperate. "Rebecca? Good Lord, child, what happened?" "Sam, I need your help. I need to use your phone, and I need somewhere safe for a few hours. Please." Sam didn't hesitate. Come in, come in. Your donkey too if he needs shelter." Between them, they got Prophet into Sam's garage, where the little donkey immediately lay down on a pile of old blankets. Rebecca gratefully accepted a glass of water and downed it in seconds, then another. "Now tell me what's going on," Sam said, handing her his cordless phone. Rebecca did, giving him the condensed version while she dialed Evelyn Whitaker's number. The old woman answered on the second ring, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "Rebecca? It's me. I got your message. Are you safe?" "For now. I'm at Sam Brooks's place. Evelyn, I found everything. All the documents, all the proof. It's all here, and it's exactly what we needed. Thank God. The Blackwoods? They've been after me all day. They're watching my house right now, waiting for me to come home. But I got away, and they don't know where I am." "Good. Stay there. I'm calling some people, journalists I trust, lawyers who aren't connected to the Blackwood family, and the state police. We're going to do this right. By morning, there will be so many people involved that the Blackwoods won't be able to intimidate or silence anyone. Can you hold out until then?" "Yes. Sam will let me stay." "Damn right I will," Sam called from across the room, having heard enough to understand the situation. "Rebecca," Evelyn's voice was fierce despite her age. "You did it. You finished what Harlan and your ancestors started. Whatever happens now, you've already won." After ending the call, Rebecca carefully removed the documents from her backpack and spread them on Sam's kitchen table. She photographed each one with Sam's smartphone, uploading the images to a cloud storage account that Evelyn had set up specifically for this purpose. Even if something happened to the original documents, the evidence would exist in multiple locations. Sam made coffee and sandwiches, and Rebecca ate ravenously, not having eaten since breakfast. As she ate, she told him the full story: the mining cooperative, the conspiracy, Harlan Castleman's 50-year investigation, the map on Prophet's hide, everything. Sam listened with growing astonishment, occasionally shaking his head. "I've lived in this county my whole life, and I never knew. Never even suspected. The Blackwoods were just the way things were. The family with money and power. I never questioned where that power came from. Most people didn't," Rebecca said. "That's how injustice persists. It becomes normal, part of the landscape, and eventually people forget there was ever a time when things were different." "Well, things are about to get very different," Sam said with satisfaction. "This is going to shake this county to its foundations." As they waited through the long night, Sam told her that other vehicles had passed by his house multiple times, black SUVs with tinted windows, driving slowly, clearly searching. But they never stopped, never suspected that Rebecca had found refuge here. Around midnight, Rebecca checked on Prophet in the garage. The little donkey was sleeping peacefully, exhausted but safe. She gently stroked his neck, feeling the peculiar markings under her fingers. "You did good, little one," she whispered. "Harlan would be proud. Dawn of a new era." The state police arrived at Sam Brooks's house just after dawn, 3 vehicles led by a senior investigator named Captain Lisa Martinez. Evelyn Whitaker had made good on her promise, contacting every authority and media outlet she could reach with a story too explosive to ignore. Behind the police came news vans from 3 different networks, their crews eager to document what was already being called the biggest historical fraud case in Appalachian history. Captain Martinez examined the documents carefully, photographing each one as evidence. "Miss Thornfield, you've potentially uncovered a major criminal conspiracy. I need to ask you some questions," and then we'll need to secure these documents as evidence. Are you willing to give a formal statement? Yes, Rebecca said without hesitation. I'll tell you everything. Over the next several hours, Rebecca recounted her story multiple times, to Captain Martinez, to Assistant State Attorney who'd been dispatched from Charleston, to the FBI agents who'd been called in because the case potentially involved federal crimes committed across state lines. She showed them the documents, explained how she'd found them, and provided context about the mining cooperative and the Blackwood family's role in its destruction. She gave them Harlan Castleman's research materials that Evelyn had provided. She even showed them Prophet, explaining the map encoded in his markings. The journalists documented everything, interviewing Rebecca, Sam, Evelyn, who'd arrived first thing in the morning, and even Prophet, whose photograph quickly became the symbol of the entire story, a tiny donkey whose unusual markings had preserved the truth for 90 years. By midday, the story had gone national. News outlets across the country were covering the miniature donkey who exposed a century of corruption. The Blackwood family's attorneys released statements denying everything, but public opinion was already turning against them. The documentary evidence was too clear, too damning to dismiss. Gerald Whitmore and his security team were arrested for assault and attempted theft. In custody, facing serious charges, Whitmore began cooperating with investigators, providing information about the Blackwood family's modern business practices that suggested the pattern of intimidation and manipulation had continued for generations. Within a week, state investigators had frozen the Blackwood family's assets pending a full audit of their business operations. The FBI opened investigations into multiple potential crimes. Descendant families of the original mining cooperative, scattered across the country, began coming forward with their own stories of how the 1933 theft had affected their families for generations. And at the center of it all was Rebecca Thornfield, the struggling mountain woman who'd bought a donkey for 25 cents and ended up toppling an empire. 3 months later. The morning frost crunched under Rebecca's boots as she walked across her property, a steaming mug of coffee warming her hands. The roof had been repaired, the porch rebuilt, and the barn reinforced. For the first time in years, the Thornfield homestead looked like a home rather than a property slowly surrendering to entropy. Prophet trotted alongside her, healthy and content, his coat glossy from proper nutrition and care. The white markings were still there, of course, permanent reminders of the map he'd carried. But now they were famous markings, recognized around the country as symbols of persistence and justice. The legal proceedings were far from over. It would take years to fully untangle 90 years of property transfers, business dealings, and ownership claims. But the initial rulings had been encouraging. A federal judge had determined that the original mining cooperative dissolution had been fraudulent and that the descendant families had legitimate claims to restitution. The Blackwood family's assets had been placed in receivership while the legal process continued. Early estimates suggested that when everything was settled, each of the 23 descendant families might receive settlements in the millions of dollars. For Rebecca, the money was almost secondary. What mattered more was that the truth had been told, that her ancestors' struggle had been vindicated, that justice, however delayed, had finally arrived. She'd become something of a celebrity, though she found the attention uncomfortable. She'd done dozens of interviews, telling and retelling her story. A documentary film crew had spent 2 weeks following her around. A major publishing house had offered her a book deal, which she'd accepted with the stipulation that Evelyn Whitaker would be listed as co-author. But through it all, what gave Rebecca the most satisfaction was walking her land without the weight of impending loss pressing down on her. The property taxes were paid. The house was secure. For the first time in her life, she could think about the future without fear. Evelyn visited often, the two of them spending hours going through historical documents and planning how to properly memorialize what had happened. They'd established a small museum in town, dedicated to preserving the history of the mining cooperative and the families it had represented. Sam Brooks had become a close friend, helping Rebecca with repairs and offering the kind of grandfatherly support she hadn't had since her father died. He often said that having a front-row seat to history had been the most exciting thing to happen to him in decades. And Prophet. Prophet had become a beloved figure in Mercer County and beyond. Children sent him letters and drawings. Visitors came specifically to see the famous donkey. A local artist had created a bronze sculpture of him that would be installed in the town square, a permanent reminder that truth, no matter how long buried, will eventually surface. As Rebecca stood watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose, Prophet beside her and her home secure behind her, she thought about her father and all the Thornfields who had worked this land before her. They'd struggled and suffered under the weight of an injustice they could never name or fight. But she had named it. She had fought it. And she had won. Not just for herself, but for all of them, for Josiah Thornfield and Silas Castleman who'd hidden the truth 90 years ago, for Harlan Castleman who'd spent 50 years searching for it, for her father who'd died without knowing his family would be vindicated, for all the families whose lives had been diminished by the Blackwood family's theft. "We did it," she whispered to Prophet, stroking his neck. "We actually did it." The miniature donkey made his soft, musical sound, and in that moment, with the mountains awakening around them and a new day beginning, Rebecca Thornfield felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Hope. The kind of hope that comes from knowing that justice, however delayed, is possible. That truth, however deeply buried, can be uncovered. That one person, armed with courage and a 25-cent donkey, can change the world. The end. Epilogue. The Mercer Mountain Mining Cooperative case continued through the courts for 3 more years before final settlements were reached. The 23 descendant families ultimately received a combined settlement of $147 million, along with restoration of mineral rights to lands that had been fraudulently taken. The Blackwood family divested most of their holdings and largely withdrew from public life, though legal proceedings against individual family members for obstruction of justice and other crimes continued for years. Prophet lived to the remarkable age of 34, spending his final years as a beloved resident of the Thornfield homestead, where he was visited by thousands of people who came to see the donkey who changed history. When he passed peacefully in his sleep in 2037, his obituary appeared in newspapers across the country. Rebecca Thornfield used her portion of the settlement to transform the family homestead into a working farm and educational center, teaching sustainable agriculture and Appalachian history. She never married, devoting her life to preserving mountain heritage and ensuring that stories like her family's would never be forgotten. The bronze statue of Prophet still stands in the Mercer County Town Square, with an inscription that reads, "Truth, like a faithful companion, will carry us through the darkest valleys to the light." And on certain autumn mornings, when frost covers the mountains and the air is crisp and clear, locals say you can still hear the soft, musical call of a miniature donkey echoing through the hollows, a reminder that some secrets are too important to stay buried forever.